Hi, I recently collaborated on a video concerning Roman Polanski's 1971 film version of William Shakespeare's Macbeth. We had a blast doing it, and questions came up in the comments afterwards that were absolutely fascinating. And I want to address just two of the comments and weave them together. They'll seem totally unrelated, but actually I don't think they are. One used the word purge to talk about Roman Polanski's use of directing the play as a way of purging the trauma that he had experienced 2 years before at Cielo Drive with the loss of his wife, his unborn child, and his friends. Thought the word was tremendously apt, and like words used when they have an aptness that just how somehow jumps off the page and starts resonating in our psyches or hearts or souls, purge caused a number of reflections. And so I looked at it not just in its simple denotative or dictionary sense, which we all know means to use the act of purgation to rid us of impurities, purge, to get rid of something. But I thought, what a fundamentally poetic term. First, you just sort of wrap your sense around the sound sense or physical presence of the word. And that's always valid to do, because here we are immersed in this incredibly rich language. And not only is the sense of the words, the semantic sense or dictionary or denotative sense of words continually coming at us, but the sound of language itself has its own deeply evocative powers. And purge is an instance of a very long single syllable. I mean, it's a single syllable, but it's all stretched out, and the mouth has to go through a lot of motions. And even in its basic sound, it is an earthy sounding and powerful word. Purge, purge, purge. The plosive P and ending with a stretched out sound, and then the J. It is an interesting sounding word. And then you start moving, what does it mean beyond the simple denotative or dictionary sense? But how about the aura of connotations? And again, it's a tremendously rich word. We have a society where binging and purging is a common and sometimes destructive activity, but a very understandable one. We have a century, we just got through a century that was so incredibly violent, the most violent century in human history, and purges, the elimination or removal of a people because of their ethnicity suddenly became a huge thing. And purge, in a historical sense, takes on a deep and dark and destructive sense. And then we have the last 120 years have been obsessed with psychiatry as a kind of modern day attempt to heal the psyche and heal the soul. And this is the sense in which purge appears in the play Macbeth. It's if thou couldst, doctor, purge the waters of my land, find her disease and purge it to a sound and pristine health, which of course we know is an impossible task because the very wound is so deeply rooted in a fundamental crime. But purge becomes connected to the psychoanalytic term catharsis, a kind of acting through and a ridding of some internal complex or some cluster of fears and desires that exists unconsciously in a sort of destructive way, or some old trauma. We purge ourselves of that trauma and no longer are moved around and have our psyches determined by it. And so the idea of catharsis becomes a kind of psychoanalytic or therapist couch goal, and also has a very commonplace: purge yourself of that trauma. That's what people do. Purge and catharsis also connect to the history of theater, where catharsis was a huge part of classical tragedy. And so to appear in a context of Macbeth and Roman Polanski's response to it, purge starts becoming not a single term, but a kind of echo chamber. Purge, with the historical resonance of it, as something that happened in Eastern Europe, which Roman Polanski was right in the middle of as a child and might have spent his life trying to, in effect, purge himself of the traumas of purges. That's one sense of it. And purge as a sense of transfiguring the trauma of what happened in Europe and then the trauma of what happened in Cielo into a work of art. But then Macbeth, and you enter a kind of echo chamber here. Macbeth uses the word purge 3 times, and always negative. Canst thou not minister to a mind disease, purge her of her sorrows? And what does the doctor reply? Therein the patient must minister to themselves. Right? That's a rough quote. That's not precise, but that's the gist of what it says. The other thing I wanted to connect this to has to do with language itself. And there's been quite a bit of very interesting discussion about the phrase helter skelter. And I had argued that there is a sense in which a paired word with 2 rhyming pairs, helter skelter, hurly burly, both of which appear in Shakespeare. You have helter skelter appearing in Henry IV, Part 1, in the sense of to ride off with chaotic dispatch. And you trace the etymology further back, and Thomas Nash used it in the same sense of something that is both hasty and disordered and chaotic. And then a reader wrote in, a commentator wrote in and said it actually goes back to Irish times, which I absolutely loved, because the Irish, in so much of their poetry and so much of their literature, had a more earthy sense of language, and I would say had more of a sense of language as existing within the rich connotative sort of orbit of meanings than just the simple dictionary sense. And you can make a lot of arguments for this. The greatest argument, I think, is the work of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, where he breaks language down enough so that the denotative or simple narrative part sort of falls away, and some of the auras of connotative meanings and resonances, and especially the sound sense of the word, which gives so much force, the force of the nursery, the force of a kind of collective unconscious voicing of witchy sounds that exist almost as verbal amulets, the raw substance of language as a communicative sound. And Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake, breaks it down so much. Night after night, one time, you'd stand forninst me fairly, laughing in your bark and tan billows of branches for to fan me coolly. And what he's doing is taking the character Anne Olivia as she is possibly dying and metaphorically flowing out to sea or some kind of regeneration. And it is nighttime and she is dreaming. So you wouldn't just want to describe it as a narrative. My name's Anne Olivia Pluribel. I have troubles at home, and I want to flow out to the sea in some great recirculative dance. No, you break it down. You strip away the denotative part, let it exist in its sound sense and connotative glory. Night after night, one time you'd stand forninst me fairly, laughing in your bark and tan billows of branches for to fan me coolly, and I'd lie quiet as a moss. And one time you'd rush upon me, darkly roaring like a great black shadow, and a sheeny stare to pierce me rawly. 3 times, and then I was the pet of everyone's then, and you were a principal girl, the panties, mammies, of course I got the in vision of Inland, and by Thoror you looked it. And then it goes to night after night, and ho halls, my heart halls, let's see, away, alas, along the river run, past Eve and Adam and bend of bay and swerve of shore, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle. And I didn't say the whole passage, maybe on a future time I will, but she is basically remembering old things in her life and something a little bit traumatic, and then she is dissolving into the forest and dissolving into the river Liffey and flowing out into the sea, and it is a splendid scene. That same kind of power is what animates a phrase like hurly-burly or helter-skelter in this case. And again, I think the way to think of it as a sort of verbal amulet. And that same kind of thinking is why a commentator's use of the word purge, which had so much historical resonance and psychological resonance and the act of taking a toxin and ridding ourselves of it, going all the way back to theories of playwriting and Shakespeare and words that actually appear in Macbeth, was so incredibly apt. And yes, purge is precisely what Roman Polanski was doing with his trauma when he used it to transform that grief and horror and dislocation of self and psyche, an immense sense of loss, into probably the greatest film production of William Shakespeare's Macbeth that has ever been created.